In the last 24 hours, I have seen a lot of people asking, why did Canada not come out in support of Iran? Why hasn't Canada gone against Israel and said that Iran is completely in the wrong here and taken a side? And I think a lot of people either never knew or just have totally forgotten. Canada and Iran have a really complicated history. Canada and Iran have beef. And when I say beef, I mean since 1979, Canada and Iran have had really, really complicated issues, and we cut off all diplomatic ties in 2012. In fact, Canada and Iran have been through issues through multiple prime ministers, Mulroney, Chretien, Paul Martin, Trudeau, Harper. They all have had issues with Iran. So I wanted to do a little bit of a deep dive to give you an overview of what's been going on between the two nations. I will preface this by saying it is an overview. I am sure there are people who are doing like full scholars on this topic, and I am not going to go quite that far into detail. Every single incident that I mentioned over those decades could have an entire video just about it. But I wanted to give sort of a basic guiding principles sort of overview. Let's start with Mark Carney's statement yesterday. So Mark Carney came out and said, Canada reaffirms Israel's right to defend itself and to ensure its security. We call on all parties to exercise maximum restraint and move towards a diplomatic resolution. People weren't super pleased. That's a statement that sort of has kicked off people being pretty angry and not just coming out and condemning Israel. And I think because of everything that's gone on with Gaza, people were expecting Canada to condemn Israel. So I'm going to do this chronologically, but I will just mention we haven't had any diplomatic relations since 2012. It was actually during a summit in Russia, I think it was the APEC summit in Russia, where the Canadian Foreign Affairs Minister came out and just publicly severed ties. When we severed ties, we made it pretty clear. It was during the support when Iran was supporting the Syrian regime, the Assad regime. We also said that there was non-compliance with the UN resolutions surrounding nuclear weapons and energy. They had continued to make threats towards Israel. Most importantly, we were also afraid for the safety of Canadian diplomats. So in 2012, we shut down our embassy, and I will get into that a little bit more later. Ironically, 2012 was also the year that Argo came out, and I believe won an Oscar. At least I remember Ben Affleck winning an Oscar. If you remember seeing the movie Argo, you might also remember that a lot of this kicked off in 1979. So let me back it up a little bit before then. Canada had previously had diplomatic relations through England and then worked to set up our own embassy in Iran. That started in 1961. Canada opened our first embassy in Tehran at that time. In 1979, during the Iranian Revolution, Ayatollah Khomeini took over. Canada evacuated 850 people before any of the events of Argo took place, before we still had embassy staff there and we hid the Americans and everybody had left during that time. I think Argo is a really good starting point as a movie, although some Canadians have been like, we kind of rewrote history there. So there's a lot of good reading material. You could read about this at length if you'd like to. Basically, though, it was an operation between Canada and the US CIA. In 1979, the incidents that take place in Argo, it was the Iranian Revolution, and Canada's embassy actually hid a bunch of Americans and got them out of the country. And after that, realized that our Canadian people on the ground in Iran would be a target if they stayed. So in 1980, we officially closed down our embassy in Tehran. So from 1980 to 1988, under Brian Mulroney, we didn't have diplomatic relations, but we hadn't severed ties. So we were still sort of like tentatively working things out. We were really worried that something was going to happen to Canadians if we reopened the embassy there. But in 1988, we finally reopened an embassy in Tehran at a very low level. But Iran still wasn't sure about Canada. Iran didn't open an embassy in Ottawa until 1991. Workers from Iran had already been living in Ottawa, but they didn't officially reestablish an embassy until 1988. But even reestablishing the embassy, there wasn't an ambassador. It was a chargé. There was workers there, but there wasn't an official ambassador. That wouldn't come until later. In 1996, under Chretien, we finally got an ambassador exchange. So we sent a Canadian to Tehran, and somebody came from Iran and was in Ottawa, and we had official ambassador status. However, there was a lot of restrictions still placed between the two nations. Basically, one of the big ones is air travel. So Canadians cannot travel directly to Iran. Iranians cannot travel directly to Canada. I have had the great pleasure of having quite a few Persian friends and coworkers, and I know that when they have to visit family, they often have to meet in a third country. So they'll meet in Turkey or Greece or somewhere else because it is such a pain to try to connect between the two. Even though we had re-upped our sort of, we have ambassadors, we're working with each other in 96, we were still, or Canada as a country was still very concerned about the human rights abuses and everything else taking place in Iran. So we had like one eye on them. Then in 2003, things went from tense to very bad. So Canada was already really worried. They were worried about the treatment of women in Iran. They were worried about the treatment of Jewish people in Iran and people of the Baha'i faith in Iran. So we had one eye on them. But in 2003, things went from very tense to extremely bad. When a Montreal-born Canadian-Iranian photographer was taking pictures of a student protest outside of an Iranian prison. She was arrested. Her name was Zahra Kazemi. And while she was in arrest, she was killed by Iranian police. She had been in custody for 3 weeks. Iran said it was due to a stroke, but there was a doctor who examined her and found signs of torture, rape, and other abuses that had happened during her being held in detention for 3 weeks. And he actually came forward, really interesting story, but he came forward and released the details to Canada and then claimed asylum and moved here himself. In reaction to this, Zahra was given a posthumous award from the Canadian Journalists for Freedom of Expression. Meanwhile, Canada went to the UN and they drafted a resolution against Iran. Specifically, it was against Iran's use of torture. Iran, in turn, responded to this by saying, quote, "The Canadian government has the worst, most backward, and racist judiciary system." It wouldn't be the last instance of a journalist or a blogger being held. In 2008, there was a Canadian-Iranian journalist in Tehran. His name was Hossein Darakhshan, and he was detained for making comments about the Shiite faith. But let's back up. So the horrible killing of Zahra happened in 2003. Canada went to the UN. We said a resolution against them. Things got worse between 2005 and 2010. At the time, the president of Iran was Ahmadinejad, and he gave a speech at a conference that was called The World Without Zionism. It was so anti-Semitic that the current prime minister in Canada at that time, Paul Martin, came out against it and actually summoned the Iranian ambassador to Ottawa to give him a formal reprimand. There was a ton of back and forth at this time between both Iran and Canada. At one point, Iran even called Canada a den of spies for the Americans. So in 2010, there was a new amendment to an old act that had passed that allowed Canada to put in more sanctions against Iran. And at that time, because of the sanctions, it meant that TD Bank shut down a lot of accounts for Persian people who were living here. In 2012, Canada took it a step further and we froze all remaining trade with Iran completely. This was under the Harper government. The Foreign Affairs Minister Bard, under Stephen Harper, his plan was to increase all pressure on Iran as much as possible through economic sanctions. Basically, he said he wanted the government of Iran to either surrender or collapse. Canada took a really unique and hardline position in this. We decided to cut all ties with Iran. Meanwhile, the US, the UK, France, and Germany decided they would just keep negotiating with them. A lot of what was coming up here, in addition to the human rights abuses that were going on, was a lot to do with the nuclear program, back and forth and back and forth. But Canada had hit a point where they just cut all ties. That brings us back to the big split. So after we've had the economic sanctions, after our foreign affairs minister said that they wanted to force them to surrender, that's when we formally pulled out of Iran. That's when we closed our embassies and severed all ties diplomatically. Canada formally listed Iran as a state sponsor of terrorism, and we listed them under the Justice for Victims of Terrorism Act. Meanwhile, Iran found out that Canada had done this, and they decided to also withdraw their embassy. But they did it in a fashion of pinning a note to the front of the embassy door in Ottawa. And the note read, Because of the hostile decision by the government of Canada, the Embassy of the Islamic Republic of Iran in Ottawa is closed and has no choice but to stop providing any consular services for its dear citizens. So ever since then, if you are Iranian in Canada and you need consular help, a lot of times people have to go into Washington State or somewhere else to get it. Since that time, there is something that's called a protecting power. So Iran and Canada have designates in each other's countries that can help their citizens. For Canadians in Iran, Switzerland is the go-to, and for Iranians in Canada, Italy is the go-to. So basically, we each have somebody in our corner so that people can still get help, but it's formally called a protecting power. So under Harper, 2012, things have gotten really bad. We've severed all ties. The embassies have pulled out. It's bad. In 2015, Justin Trudeau takes power, and he says one of the first things that he wants to do is to try and reestablish some sort of tie. Now, you also have to take into effect that in the United States, they had still been negotiating with the EU and the UN to do the JCPOA, the agreement that was trying to limit the nuclear proliferation in Iran that Obama negotiated. Unfortunately, Trump overturned when he got power, but the Obama administration worked for 9 years along with the EU and the UN to get this agreement in place. So in 2015, Justin Trudeau came out and said, okay, we want to have more diplomatic relations. Let's try this again, see what we can do. And in 2015, we did. We did lift some of the economic sanctions. We didn't reestablish embassies, but we were talking again. But it didn't last. It would soon turn extremely bad once again. In January of 2020, there was a Ukrainian Airways flight that was shot down by Iranian military. 57 Canadians were on board. 57 Canadian Iranians were on board. It was a horrible tragedy. Canada has quite a large, robust Persian population, and it was just awful. Then in 2022, there was a series of protests that broke out in Iran because of the death of Mahsa Amini. Mahsa Amini was killed by police for not covering her hair properly. And as a result, a bunch of protests broke out throughout Iran that were dealing with how women are treated there. Because Canada has such a large Persian population, they asked the Canadian government to make a statement to do something as well. In October of 2022, Canada formally sanctioned the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. At the time, they banned 10,000 members of the IRGC from ever coming into Canada again. It represented about 50% of the IRGC and targeted the higher level people. At the time, our Deputy Prime Minister was Chrystia Freeland, and she gave a speech which called Iran a state sponsor of terror, called them oppressive, theocratic, and misogynist. She also said that the IRGC leadership are terrorists and the IRGC itself is a terrorist organization. In 2023, as a reaction, Iran took Canada to International Court of Justice for allowing victims of alleged terror attacks to claim damages from Tehran. By 2024, the Public Safety Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, announced that Canada had designated the IRGC as a terrorist organization under the nation's criminal code, citing disregard for human rights, a willingness to destabilize the international rules-based order. Under the designation, thousands of senior Iranian officials were no longer allowed into Canada. That included the top IRGC officials, completely banned. Iran did not take this well. They immediately responded with a threat in which they said, Canadian government will be responsible for the consequences of this provocative and irresponsible decision. So with all that said, Canada has had a long history with Iran. As I said earlier, I could have talked about each of these individual instances forever. But this just illustrates sort of the overview of everything that's happened. So when you hear that our Prime Minister is not coming out against Iran's actions, even though everything with Israel and Iran is quite complicated, do know that it is because Canada has historically backed Israel since Israel's founding, but also the factor of Canada's very, very contentious relationship with Iran needs to be taken into account. I will say that this is no reflection about how Canadians or the Canadian government feel about the Iranian people. I have had the great fortune of knowing and having great friends who are Persian and getting to sort of experience their culture and hear stories from them as well. And I know that it has been extremely difficult for them. this conflict, it has made life difficult in wanting to see their relatives, having their relatives come and visit, just basic back and forth that a lot of people, Canada is a country of immigrants, it makes it a lot more difficult than people from other places. So I hope this gives you a bit of an overview, a bit more of an understanding about what's been going on between the two countries. And I would just say, I would give it a little bit of time. I'm sure there are a lot of things going on behind the scenes that we don't know about right now, but it's very easy to react heavily. And I would say just take a moment.